One day my mother told me that we were going to Memphis on a boat, the Kate Adams. How big is the boat? I asked my mother. As big as a mountain, she said. Has it got a whistle? Yes. Does the whistle blow? Yes. When? When the captain wants it to blow. How long will we be on the boat? All day and all night. Will we sleep on the boat? Yes, when we get sleepy, we'll sleep. Now hush. For days I had dreamed about a huge white boat floating on a vast body of water. But when my mother took me down to the levee on the day of leaving, I saw a tiny, dirty boat that was not at all like the boat I had imagined. I was disappointed, and when time came to go on board, I cried, and my mother thought that I did not want to go with her to Memphis, and I could not tell her what the trouble was. Solace came when I wandered about the boat and gazed at Negroes throwing dice, drinking whiskey, playing cards, lolling on boxes, eating, talking, and singing. My father took me down into the engine room, and the throbbing machines enthralled me for hours. In Memphis, we lived in a one-story brick tenement. The stone buildings and the concrete pavements looked bleak and hostile to me. The absence of green growing things made the city seem dead. Living space for the four of us, my mother, my brother, my father, and me, was a kitchen and a bedroom. In the front and rear were paved areas in which my brother and I could play, but for days I was afraid to go into the strange city streets alone. Hunger stole upon me so slowly that at first I was not aware of what hunger really meant. Hunger had always been more or less at my elbow when I played, but now I began to wake up at night to find hunger staring at me gauntly. The hunger I had known before this had been no grim, hostile stranger. It had been a normal hunger that had made me beg constantly for bread, and when I ate a crust or two, I was satisfied. But this new hunger baffled me, scared me, made me angry and insistent. I would grow dizzy, and my vision would dim. I became less active in my play, and for the first time in my life I had to pause and think of what was happening to me. "Mama, I'm hungry," I complained one afternoon. "You'll have to wait." "But I want to eat now." "But there's nothing to eat," she told me. "Why?" "Just because there's none," she explained. "But I want to eat," I said, beginning to cry. She was ironing, and she paused and looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Where's your father?" she asked me. I stared in bewilderment. Yes, it was true that my father had not come home to sleep for many days now, and I could make as much noise as I wanted. Though I had not known why he was absent, I had been glad that he was not there to shout his restrictions at me. But it had never occurred to me that his absence would mean that there would be no food. "I don't know," I said. "Who brings food into the house?" my mother asked me. "Papa," I said. "He always brought food." "Well, your father isn't here now," she said. "Where is he?" "I don't know," she said. "But I'm hungry," I whimpered, stomping my feet. "You'll have to wait until I get a job and buy food," she said. As the days slid past, the image of my father became associated with my pangs of hunger, and whenever I felt hunger, I thought of him with a deep biological bitterness. My mother finally went to work as a cook, and left me and my brother alone in the flat each day with a loaf of bread and a pot of tea. When she returned at evening, she would be tired and dispirited, and would cry a lot. Sometimes, when she was in despair, she would call us to her and talk to us for hours, telling us that we now had no father, that our lives would be different from those of other children, that we must learn as soon as possible to take care of ourselves, to dress ourselves, to prepare our own food, that we must take upon ourselves the responsibility of the flat while she worked. Half frightened, we would promise solemnly. We did not understand what had happened between our father and our mother, and the most that these long talks did to us was to make us feel a vague dread. Whenever we asked why father had left, she would tell us that we were too young to know. One evening my mother told me that thereafter I would have to do the shopping for food. She took me to the corner store to show me the way. I was proud. I felt like a grown-up. The next afternoon, I looped the basket over my arm and went down the pavement toward the store. When I reached the corner, a gang of boys grabbed me, knocked me down, snatched the basket, took the money, and sent me running home in panic. That evening, I told my mother what had happened, but she made no comment. She sat down at once, wrote another note, gave me more money, and sent me out to the grocery again. I crept down the steps and saw the same gang of boys playing down the street. I ran back into the house. "What's the matter?" my mother asked. "It's those same boys," I said. "They'll beat me." "You've got to get over that," she said. "Now go on." "I'm scared," I said. "Go on and don't pay any attention to them," she said. I went out of the door and walked briskly down the sidewalk, praying that the gang would not molest me. But when I came abreast of them, someone shouted, "There he is!" They came toward me, and I broke into a wild run toward home. They overtook me and flung me to the pavement. I yelled, pleaded, kicked, but they wrenched the money out of my hand. They yanked me to my feet, gave me a few slaps, and sent me home sobbing. My mother met me at the door. "They beat me," I gasped. They took the money." I started up the steps, seeking the shelter of the house. "Don't you come in here," my mother warned me. I froze in my tracks and stared at her. "But they're coming after me," I said. "You just stay right where you are," she said in a deadly tone. "I'm going to teach you this night to stand up and fight for yourself." She went into the house, and I waited, terrified, wondering what she was about. Presently she returned with more money and another note. She also had a long, heavy stick. "Take this money, this note, and this stick," she said. "Go to the store and buy those groceries. If those boys bother you, then fight." I was baffled. My mother was telling me to fight, a thing she had never done before. "But I'm scared," I said. "Don't you come into this house until you've gotten those groceries," she said. "They'll beat me, I said. "Then stay in the streets. Don't come back here." I ran up the steps and tried to force my way past her into the house. A stinging slap came on my jaw. I stood on the sidewalk, crying. "Please, let me wait until tomorrow," I begged. "No," she said. "Go now. If you come back into this house without those groceries, I'll whip you." She slammed the door, and I heard the key turn in the lock. I shook with fright. I was alone upon the dark, hostile streets, and the gangs were after me. I had the choice of being beaten at home or away from home. I clutched the stick, crying, trying to reason. If I were beaten at home, there was absolutely nothing that I could do about it. But if I were beaten in the streets, I had a chance to fight and defend myself. I walked slowly down the sidewalk, coming closer to the gang of boys, holding the stick tightly. I was so full of fear that I could scarcely breathe. I was almost upon them now. "There he is again!" the cry went up. They surrounded me quickly and began to grab for my hand. "I'll kill you," I threatened. They closed in. In blind fear, I let the stick fly, feeling it crack against a boy's skull. I swung again, lamming another skull, then another. Realizing that they would retaliate if I let up for but a second, I fought to lay them low, to knock them cold, to kill them so that they could not strike back at me. I flayed with tears in my eyes, teeth clenched, stark fear making me throw every ounce of my strength behind each blow. I hit again and again, dropping the money and the grocery list. The boys scattered, yelling, nursing their heads, staring at me in utter disbelief. They had never seen such frenzy. I stood panting, egging them on, taunting them to come on and fight. When they refused, I ran after them, and they tore out for their homes, screaming. The parents of the boys rushed into the streets and threatened me, and for the first time in my life I shouted at grown-ups, telling them that I would give them the same if they bothered me. I finally found my grocery list and the money and went to the store. On my way back, I kept my stick poised for instant use, but there was not a single boy in sight. That night, I won the right to the streets of Memphis. One cold morning, my mother awakened me and told me that because there was no coal in the house, she was taking my brother to the job with her, and that I must remain in bed until the coal she had ordered was delivered. For the payment of the coal, she left a note together with some money under the dresser scarf. I went back to sleep and was awakened by the ringing of the doorbell. I opened the door, let in the coal man, and gave him the money and the note. He brought in a few bushels of coal, then lingered, asking me if I were cold. Yes, I said, shivering. He made a fire, then sat and smoked. How much change do I owe you? He asked me. I don't know, I said. Shame on you, he said. Don't you know how to count? No, sir, I said. Listen and repeat after me, he said. He counted to 10, and I listened carefully. Then he asked me to count alone, and I did. He then made me memorize the words 20, 30, 40, etc. Then told me to add 1, 2, 3, and so on. In about an hour's time I had learned to count to 100, and I was overjoyed. Long after the coal man had gone, I danced up and down on the bed in my nightclothes, counting again and again to 100, afraid that if I did not keep repeating the numbers I would forget them. When my mother returned from her job that night, I insisted that she stand still and listen while I counted to 100. She was dumbfounded. After that, she taught me to read, told me stories. On Sundays, I would read the newspapers with my mother guiding me and spelling out the words. I soon made myself a nuisance by asking far too many questions of everybody. Every happening in the neighborhood, no matter how trivial, became my business. It was in this manner that I first stumbled upon the relations between whites and blacks, and what I learned frightened me. Though I had long known that there were people called white people, it had never meant anything to me emotionally. I had seen white men and women upon the streets 1,000 times, but they had never looked particularly white. To me they were merely people like other people, yet somehow strangely different, because I had never come in close touch with any of them. For the most part, I never thought of them. They simply existed somewhere in the background of the city as a whole. It might have been that my tardiness in learning to sense white people as white people came from the fact that many of my relatives were white-looking people. My grandmother, who was white as any white person, had never looked white to me. And when word circulated among the black people of the neighborhood that a black boy had been severely beaten by a white man, I felt that the white man had a right to beat the black boy, for I naively assumed that the white man must have been the black boy's father. And did not all fathers, like my father, have the right to beat their children? A paternal right was the only right, to my understanding, that a man had to beat a child. But when my mother told me that the white man was not the father of the black boy, was no kin to him at all, I was puzzled. Then why did the white man whip the black boy? I asked my mother. The white man did not whip the black boy, my mother told me. He beat the black boy. But why? You're too young to understand. I'm not going to let anybody beat me, I said stoutly. Then stop running wild in the streets, my mother said. I brooded for a long time about the seemingly causeless beating of the black boy by the white man, and the more questions I asked, the more bewildering it all became. Whenever I saw white people now, I stared at them, wondering what they were really like. My mother fell ill, and the problem of food became an acute daily agony. Hunger was with us always. Sometimes the neighbors would feed us, or a dollar bill would come in the mail from my grandmother. My mother arrived one afternoon with the news that we were going to live with her sister in Elaine, Arkansas, and that en route we would visit Granny, who had moved from Natchez to Jackson, Mississippi. As the words fell from my mother's lips, a long and heavy anxiety lifted from me. Excited, I rushed about and gathered my ragged clothes. Granny's home in Jackson was an enchanting place to explore. It was a 2-story frame structure of 7 rooms. My brother and I used to play hide-and-seek in the long, narrow hallways and on and under the stairs. Granny's son, Uncle Clark, had bought her this home, and its white plastered walls, its front and back porches, its round columns and banisters made me feel that surely there was no finer house in all the round world. There were wide green fields in which my brother and I roamed and played and shouted, And there were the timid children of the neighbors, boys and girls, to whom my brother and I felt superior in worldly knowledge. We took pride in telling them what it was like to ride on a train, what the yellow, sleepy Mississippi River looked like, how it felt to sail on the Kate Adams, what Memphis looked like, and how I had run off from the orphan home. And we would hint that we were pausing for but a few days, and then would be off to even more fabulous places and marvelous experiences. To help support the household, my grandmother boarded a colored school teacher, Ella, a young woman with so remote and dreamy and silent a manner that I was as much afraid of her as I was attracted to her. I had long wanted to ask her to tell me about the books that she was always reading, but I could never quite summon enough courage to do so. One afternoon I found her sitting alone upon the front porch, reading. "Ella," I begged, "please tell me what you are reading." "It's just a book," she said evasively, looking about with apprehension. "But what's it about?" I asked. "Your grandmother wouldn't like it if I talked to you about novels," she told me. I detected a note of sympathy in her voice. "I don't care," I said loudly and bravely. "Shh, you mustn't say things like that," she said. "But I want to know." "When you grow up, you'll read books and you'll know what's in them," she explained. "But I want to know now." She thought a while, then closed the book. "Come here," she said. I sat at her feet and lifted my face to hers. "Once upon a time there was an old man named Bluebeard," she began in a low voice. She whispered to me the story of Bluebeard and his 7 wives, and I ceased to see the porch, the sunshine, her face, everything. As her words fell upon my new ears, I endowed them with a reality that welled up from somewhere within me. She told how Bluebeard had duped and married his 7 wives, how he had loved and slain them. The tale made the world around me be, throb, live. As she spoke, reality changed. The look of things altered, and the world became peopled with magical presences. My sense of life deepened, and the feel of things was different somehow. Enchanted and enthralled, I stopped her constantly to ask for details. My imagination blazed. The sensations the story aroused in me were never to leave me. When she was about to finish, when my interest was keenest, when I was lost to the world around me, Granny stepped briskly onto the porch. "You stop that, you evil gal," she shouted. "I want none of that devil stuff in my house." Her voice jarred me so that I gasped. For a moment I did not know what was happening. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson," Ella stammered, rising, "but he asked me—" "He's just a foolish child, and you know it," Granny blazed. Ella bowed her head and went into the house. "But, Granny, she didn't finish," I protested, knowing that I should have kept quiet. She bared her teeth and slapped me across my mouth with the back of her hand. "You shut your mouth," she hissed. "You don't know what you're talking about." "But I want to hear what happened," I wailed, dodging another blow that I thought was coming. "That's the devil's work," she shouted. My grandmother was as nearly white as a Negro can get without being white, which means that she was white. The sagging flesh of her face quivered. Her eyes, large, dark, deep-set, wide apart, glared at me. Her lips narrowed to a line, her high forehead wrinkled. When she was angry, her eyelids drooped halfway down over her pupils, giving her a baleful aspect. "But I liked the story," I told her. "You're going to burn in hell," she said with such furious conviction that for a moment I believed her. Not to know the end of the tale filled me with a sense of emptiness. Loss. I hungered for the sharp, frightening, breathtaking, almost painful excitement that the story had given me, and I vowed that as soon as I was old enough I would buy all the novels there were and read them to feed that thirst for violence that was in me, for intrigue, for plotting, for secrecy, for bloody murders. I had tasted what to me was life, and I would have more of it somehow, some way. I realized that they could not understand what I was feeling, and I kept quiet. But when no one was looking, I would slip into Ella's room and steal a book and take it back to the barn and try to read it. Usually I could not decipher enough words to make the story have meaning. I burned to learn to read novels, and I tortured my mother into telling me the meaning of every strange word I saw, not because the word itself had any value, but because it was the gateway to a forbidden and enchanting land. At last we were at the railroad station with our bags, waiting for the train that would take us to Arkansas. And for the first time I noticed that there were two lines of people at the ticket window, a white line and a black line. During my visit at Granny's, a sense of the two races had been born in me with a sharp concreteness that would never die until I died. When I boarded the train, I was aware that we Negroes were in one part of the train and that the whites were in another. Naively, I wanted to go and see how the whites looked while sitting in their part of the train. "Can I go and peep at the white folks?" I asked my mother. "You keep quiet," she said. "But that wouldn't be wrong, would it?" "Will you keep still?" "But why can't I?" "Quit talking foolishness." I had begun to notice that my mother became irritated when I questioned her about whites and blacks, and I could not quite understand it. I wanted to understand these two sets of people who lived side by side and never touched, it seemed, except in violence. Now there was my grandmother. Was she white? Just how white was she? What did the whites think of her whiteness? "Mama, is Granny white?" I asked as the train rolled through the darkness. "If you've got eyes, you can see what color she is," my mother said. "I mean, do the white folks think she's white?" "Why don't you ask the white folks that?" she countered. "But you know," I insisted. "Why should I know?" she asked. "I'm not white." "Granny looks white," I said, hoping to establish one fact at least. "Then why is she living with us colored folks?" "Don't you want Granny to live with us?" she asked, blunting my question. "Yes." "Then why are you asking?" "I want to know. Doesn't Granny live with us?" "Yes." "Isn't that enough?" "But does she want to live with us?" "Why didn't you ask Granny that?" my mother evaded me again in a taunting voice. "Did Granny become colored when she married Grandpa?" "Will you stop asking silly questions?" "But did she?" "Granny didn't become colored," my mother said angrily. "She was born the color she is now." Again I was being shut out of the secret, the thing, the reality I felt somewhere beneath all the words and silences. "Why didn't Granny marry a white man?" I asked. "Because she didn't want to," my mother said peevishly. "Why don't you want to talk to me?" I asked. She slapped me and I cried. Later, grudgingly, she told me that Granny came of Irish, Scotch, and French stock, in which Negro blood had somewhere and somehow been infused. She explained it all in a matter-of-fact, off-hand, neutral way. Her emotions were not involved at all. "What was Granny's name before she married Grandpa?" "Bolden." "Who gave her that name?" "The white man who owned her." "She was a slave?" "Yes." "And Bolden was the name of Granny's father?" "Granny doesn't know who her father was." "So they just gave her any name?" "They gave her a name, that's all I know." "Couldn't Granny find out who her father was?" "For what, silly? So she could know." "Know for what?" "Just to know." "But for what?" I could not say. I could not get anywhere. "Mama, where did Father get his name?" "From his father." "And where did the father of my father get his name?" "Like Granny got hers. From a white man." "Do they know who he is?" "I don't know." "Why don't they find out?" "For what?" my mother demanded harshly. And I could think of no rational or practical reason why my father should try to find out who his father's father was. "What has Papa got in him?" I asked. "Some white and some red and some black," she said. "Indian, white, and Negro?" "Yes." "Then what am I?" "They'll call you a colored man when you grow up," she said. Then she turned to me and smiled mockingly and asked, "Do you mind, Mr. Wright?" I was angry, and I did not answer. I did not object to being called colored, but I knew that there was something my mother was holding back. She was not concealing facts, but feelings, attitudes, convictions which she did not want me to know, and she became angry when I prodded her. All right, I would find out someday. Just wait. All right, I was colored. It was fine. I did not know enough to be afraid or to anticipate in a concrete manner. True, I had heard that colored people were killed and beaten, but so far it had all seemed remote. There was, of course, a vague uneasiness about it all, but I would be able to handle that when I came to it. It would be simple. If anybody tried to kill me, then I would kill them first. When we arrived in Elaine, I saw that Aunt Maggie lived in a bungalow that had a fence around it. It looked like home, and I was glad. I had no suspicion that I was to live here for but a short time, and that the manner of my leaving would be my first baptism of racial emotion. A wide, dusty road ran past the house, and on each side of the road wildflowers grew. It was summer, and the smell of clay dust was everywhere, day and night. I would get up early every morning to wade with my bare feet through the dust of the road, reveling in the strange mixture of the cold, dew-wet crust on top of the road and the warm, sun-baked dust beneath. Aunt Maggie's husband, Uncle Hoskins, owned a saloon that catered to the hundreds of Negroes who worked in the surrounding sawmills. Each day Uncle Hoskins went to his saloon in the evenings and did not return home until the early hours of the morning. Like my father, he slept in the daytime, but noise never seemed to bother Uncle Hoskins. My brother and I shouted and banged as much as we liked. Often I would creep into his room while he slept and stare at the big shining revolver that lay near his head, within quick reach of his hand. I asked Aunt Maggie why he kept the gun so close to him, and she told me that men had threatened to kill him. White men. One morning I awakened to learn that Uncle Hoskins had not come home from the saloon. Aunt Maggie fretted and worried. She wanted to visit the saloon and find out what had happened, but Uncle Hoskins had forbidden her to come to the place. The day wore on and dinner time came. "I'm going to find out if anything's happened," Aunt Maggie said. "Maybe you oughtn't," my mother said. "Maybe it's dangerous." The food was kept hot on the stove, and Aunt Maggie stood on the front porch staring into the deepening dusk. Again she declared that she was going to the saloon, but my mother dissuaded her once more. It grew dark, and still he had not come. Aunt Maggie was silent and restless. "I hope to God the white people didn't bother him," she said. Later she went into the bedroom, and when she came out she whimpered. "He didn't take his gun. I wonder what could have happened." We ate in silence. An hour later there was the sound of heavy footsteps on the front porch, and a loud knock came. Aunt Maggie ran to the door and flung it open. A tall black boy stood sweating, panting, and shaking his head. He pulled off his cap. "Mr. Hoskins, he done been shot. Done been shot by a white man," the boy gasped. "Mrs. Hoskins, he dead." Aunt Maggie screamed and rushed off the porch and down the dusty road into the night. "Maggie," my mother screamed. "Don't you all go to that saloon," the boy called. "Maggie," my mother called, running after Aunt Maggie. "They'll kill you if you go there," the boy yelled. "White folks say they'll kill all his kinfolks." My mother pulled Aunt Maggie back to the house. Fear drowned out grief, and that night we packed clothes and dishes and loaded them into a farmer's wagon. Before dawn we were rolling away, fleeing for our lives. I learned afterwards that Uncle Hoskins had been killed by whites who had long coveted his flourishing liquor business. He had been threatened with death and warned many times to leave, but he had wanted to hold on a while longer to amass more money. We got rooms in West Helena, and Aunt Maggie and my mother kept huddled in the house all day and night, afraid to be seen on the streets. Finally, Aunt Maggie defied her fear and made frequent trips back to Elaine. But she went in secret and at night, and would tell no one save my mother when she was going. There was no funeral, there was no music, there was no period of mourning. There were no flowers. There was only silence, quiet weeping, whispers, and fear. I did not know when or where Uncle Hoskins was buried. Aunt Maggie was not even allowed to see his body, nor was she able to claim any of his assets. Uncle Hoskins had simply been plucked from our midst, and we, figuratively, had fallen on our faces to avoid looking into that white, hot face of terror that we knew loomed somewhere above us. This was as close as white terror had ever come to me, and my mind reeled. Why had we not fought back, I asked my mother, and the fear that was in her made her slap me into silence. Shocked, frightened, alone without their husbands or friends, my mother and Aunt Maggie rented one half of a double-corner house in front of which ran a stagnant ditch carrying sewage. The neighborhood swarmed with rats, cats, dogs, fortune-tellers, cripples, blind men, whores, salesmen, rent collectors, and children. In front of our flat was a huge roundhouse where locomotives were cleaned and repaired. There was an eternal hissing of steam, the deep grunting of steel engines, and the tolling of bells. Smoke obscured the vision, and cinders drifted into the house, into our beds, into our kitchen, into our food, and a tar-like smell was always in the air. My mother could not earn enough to feed us, and my stomach kept so consistently empty that my head ached most of the day. One afternoon, hunger haunted me so acutely that I decided to try to sell my dog Betsy and buy some food. Betsy was a tiny, white, fluffy poodle given to me by my uncle, and when I had washed, dried, and combed her, she looked like a toy. I tucked her under my arm and went for the first time alone in a white neighborhood where there were wide, clean streets and big white houses. I went from door to door ringing the bells. Some white people slammed the door in my face. Others told me to come to the rear of the house, but pride would never let me do that. Finally, a young white woman came to the door and smiled. "What do you want?" she asked. "Do you want to buy a pretty dog?" I asked. "Let me see it." She took the dog into her arms and fondled and kissed it. "What's its name?" "Betsy." "She is cute," she said. "What do you want for her?" $1, I said. "Wait a moment," she said. "Let me see if I have $1." She took Betsy into the house with her, and I waited on the porch, marveling at the cleanliness, the quietness of the white world. How orderly everything was. Yet I felt out of place. I had no desire to live here. Then I remembered that these houses were the homes in which lived those white people who made Negroes leave their homes and flee into the night. I grew tense. Would someone say that I was a bad nigger and try to kill me here? What was keeping the woman so long? Would she tell other people that a nigger boy had said something wrong to her? Perhaps she was getting a mob. Maybe I ought to leave now and forget about Betsy. My mounting anxieties drowned out my hunger. I wanted to rush back to the safety of the black faces I knew. The door opened and the woman came out smiling, still hugging Betsy in her arms. But I could not see her smile now. My eyes were full of the fears I had conjured up. "I just love this dog," she said, "and I'm going to buy her." I haven't got $1. All I have is 97 cents. Though she did not know it, she was now giving me my opportunity to ask for my dog without saying that I did not want to sell her to white people. "No, ma'am," I said softly. "I want $1. "But I haven't got $1 in the house," she said. "Then I can't sell the dog," I said. "I'll give you the other 3 cents when my mother comes home tonight," she said. "No, ma'am," I said, looking stonily at the floor. "But listen, you said you wanted $1. "Yes, ma'am, $1. "You'll get $1. You'll get the 3 cents tonight." "No, ma'am." "But what could you want with $1 now?" she asked. "I want to buy something to eat," I said. "Then 97 cents will buy you a lot of food," she said. "No, ma'am, I want my dog." She stared at me for a moment and her face grew red. "Here's your dog," she snapped, thrusting Betsy into my arms. "Now get away from here. You're just about the craziest nigger boy I ever did see." I took Betsy and ran all the way home, glad that I had not sold her, but my hunger returned. Maybe I ought to have taken the 97 cents. But it was too late now. I hugged Betsy in my arms and waited. When my mother came home that night, I told her what had happened. "And you didn't take the money?" she asked. "No, ma'am." "Why?" "I don't know," I said uneasily. "Didn't you know that 97 cents is almost $1?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," I said, counting on my fingers. 98, 99, 100. But I didn't want to sell Betsy to white people. Why? Because they're white, I said. You're foolish, my mother said. A week later, Betsy was crushed to death beneath the wheels of a coal wagon. I cried and buried her in the backyard and drove a barrel staving into the ground at the head of her grave. My mother's sole comment was, "You could have had $1, but you can't eat a dead dog, can you?" I did not answer. A dread of white people now came to live permanently in my feelings and imagination. As the World War drew to a close, racial conflict flared over the entire South. And though I did not witness any of it, I could not have been more thoroughly affected by it if I had participated directly in every clash. I would stand for hours on the doorsteps of neighbors' houses listening to their talk, learning how a white woman had slapped a black woman, how a white man had killed a black man. It filled me with awe, wonder, and fear, and I asked ceaseless questions. One evening, I heard a tale that rendered me sleepless for nights. It was of a Negro woman whose husband had been seized and killed by a mob. It was claimed that the woman vowed she would avenge her husband's death, and she took a shotgun, wrapped it in a sheet, and went humbly to the whites, pleading that she be allowed to take her husband's body for burial. It seemed that she was granted permission to come to the side of her dead husband, while the whites, silent and armed, looked on. The woman, so went the story, knelt and prayed, then proceeded to unwrap the sheet, and before the white men realized what was happening, she had taken the gun from the sheet and had slain 4 of them, shooting at them from her knees. I did not know if the story was factually true or not, but it was emotionally true, because I had already grown to feel that there existed men against whom I was powerless, men who could violate my life at will. I resolved that I would emulate the black woman if I were ever faced with a white mob. I would conceal a weapon, pretend that I had been crushed by the wrong done to one of my loved ones. Then, just when they thought I had accepted their cruelty as the law of my life, I would let go with my gun and kill as many of them as possible before they killed me. My fantasies lived in my mind because I felt completely helpless in the face of this threat that might come upon me at any time, and because there did not exist, to my knowledge, any possible course of action which could have saved me if I had ever been confronted with a white mob. These fantasies were no longer a reflection of my reaction to the white people. They were a part of my living, of my emotional life. They were a culture, a creed, a religion. I had never in my life been abused by whites, but I had already become as conditioned to their existence as though I had been the victim of 1,000 lynchings. Having grown taller and older, I now associated with older boys, and I had to pay for my admittance into their company by subscribing to certain racial sentiments. Of an afternoon when school had let out, I would saunter down the street, idly kicking an empty tin can or knocking a stick against the palings of a wooden fence, or whistling until I would stumble upon one or more of the gang loitering at a corner, standing in a field, or sitting upon the steps of somebody's house. "Hey," timidly. "You eat yet?" Uneasily trying to make conversation. "Yeah, man, I done really fed my face." And the talk would weave, roll, surge, spurt, veer, swell, having no specific aim or direction, touching vast areas of life, expressing the tentative impulses of childhood. Money, God, race, sex, color, war, planes, machines, trains, swimming, boxing, anything. Night would fall, bats would zip through the air, crickets would cry from the grass, frogs would croak, the stars would come out. Dew would dampen the earth. Yellow squares of light would glow in the distance as kerosene lamps were lit in our homes. Finally, from across the fields or down the road, a long, slow yell would come. "You, Dave!" Easy laughter among the boys, but no reply. "Calling the hogs." "Go home, pig." Laughter again. A boy would slowly detach himself from the gang. You, Dave. He would not answer his mother's call, for that would have been a sign of dependence. I'll do you all like the farmer did the potato, the boy would say. How's that? Plant you now and dig you later. The boy would trot home slowly, and there would be more easy laughter, more talk. One by one we would be called home to fetch water from the hydrant in the backyard, or to go to the store and buy greens and meal for tomorrow, to split wood for kindling. We were now large enough for the white boys to fear us, and both of us, the white boys and the black boys, began to play our traditional racial roles as though we had been born to them, as though it was in our blood, as though we were being guided by instinct. All the frightful descriptions we had heard about each other, all the violent expressions of hate and hostility that had seeped into us from our surroundings came now to the surface to guide our actions. The roundhouse was the racial boundary of the neighborhood, and it had been tacitly agreed between the white boys and the black boys that the whites were to keep to the far side of the roundhouse, and we blacks were to keep to our side. Whenever we caught a white boy on our side, we stoned him. If we strayed to their side, they stoned us. Our battles were real and bloody. We threw rocks, cinders, coal sticks, pieces of iron, and broken bottles. And while we threw them, we longed for even deadlier weapons. If we were hurt, we took it quietly. There was no crying or whimpering. If our wounds were not truly serious, we hid them from our parents. We did not want to be beaten for fighting. Once in a battle with a gang of white boys, I was struck behind the ear with a piece of broken bottle. The cut was deep and bled profusely. I tried to stem the flow of blood by dabbing at the cut with a rag, and when my mother came from work, I was forced to tell her that I was hurt, for I needed medical attention. She rushed me to a doctor who stitched my scalp, but when she took me home, she beat me, telling me that I must never fight white boys again, that I might be killed by them, that she had to work and had no time to worry about my fights. Her words did not sink in, for they conflicted with the code of the streets. I promised my mother that I would not fight, but I knew that if I kept my word, I would lose my standing in the gang, and the gang's life was my life. My mother became too ill to work, and I began to do chores in the neighborhood. Mother, her health failing rapidly, spoke constantly now of Granny's home, of how ardently she wanted to see us grow up before she died. Already there had crept into her speech a halting, lisping quality that, though I did not know it, was the shadow of her future. I was more conscious of my mother now than I had ever been, and I was already able to feel what being completely without her would mean. A slowly rising dread stole into me, and I would look at my mother for long moments, but when she would look at me, I would look away. Then real fear came as her illness recurred at shorter intervals. Time stood still. My brother and I waited, hungry and afraid. One morning a shouting voice awakened me. "Richard! Richard!" I rolled out of bed. My brother came running into the room. "Richard! You better come and see Mama. She's very sick," he said. I ran into my mother's room and saw her lying upon her bed, dressed, her eyes open, her mouth gaped. She was very still. "Mama!" I called. She did not answer or turn her head. I reached forward to shake her, but drew back, afraid that she was dead. "Mama!" I called again, my mind unable to grasp that she could not answer. Finally I went to her and shook her. She moved slightly and groaned. My brother and I called her repeatedly, but she did not speak. Was she dying? It seemed unthinkable. My brother and I looked at each other. We did not know what to do. "We better get somebody," I said. I ran into the hallway and called a neighbor. A tall black woman bustled out of a door. "Please, won't you come and see my mama? She won't talk. We can't wake her up. She's terribly sick," I told her. She followed me into the flat. "Mrs. Wright," she called to my mother. My mother lay still, unseeing, silent. The woman felt my mother's hands. "She ain't dead," she said, "but she's sick all right. I better get some more of the neighbors. 5 or 6 of the women came, and my brother and I waited in the hallway while they undressed my mother and put her to bed. When we were allowed back into the room, a woman said, "Looks like a stroke to me." "Just like paralysis," said another. My brother and I stood against a wall while the bustling women worked frantically over my mother. A stroke? Paralysis? What were those things? Would she die? One of the women asked me if there was any money in the house. I did not know. They searched through the dresser and found $1 or 2 and sent for a doctor. The doctor arrived. Yes, he told us, my mother had suffered a stroke of paralysis. She was in a serious condition. She needed someone with her day and night. She needed medicine. Later that day, I rummaged through drawers and found Granny's address. I wrote her, pleading with her to come and help us. The utter loneliness was now terrifying. I had been suddenly thrown emotionally upon my own. Within an hour, the half-friendly world I had known had turned cold and hostile. I was too frightened to weep. I was glad that my mother was not dead, but there was the fact that she would be sick for a long, long time, perhaps for the balance of her life. I became morose. Though I was a child, I could no longer feel as a child, could no longer react as a child. The desire for play was gone, and I brooded, wondering if Granny would come and help us. I tried not to think of a tomorrow that was neither real nor wanted, for all tomorrows held questions that I could not answer. I was tense during the days I waited for Granny, and when she came I gave up, letting her handle things, answering questions automatically, obeying, knowing that somehow I had to face things alone. I withdrew into myself. I wrote letters that Granny dictated to her 8 children. There were 9 of them, including my mother, in all parts of the country, asking for money with which to take Ella and her 2 little children to our home. Money came, and again there were days of packing household effects. My mother was taken to the train in an ambulance and put on board upon a stretcher. We rode to Jackson in silence, and my mother was put to bed upstairs. Aunt Maggie came from Detroit to help nurse and clean. The big house was quiet. We spoke in lowered voices. We walked with soft tread. The odor of medicine hung in the air. Doctors came and went. Night and day I could hear my mother groaning. We thought that she would die at any moment. Once in the night my mother called me to her bed and told me that she could not endure the pain, that she wanted to die. I held her hand and begged her to be quiet. That night I ceased to react to my mother. My feelings were frozen. I merely waited upon her, knowing that she was suffering. She remained abed 10 years, gradually growing better, but never completely recovering, relapsing periodically into her paralytic state. The family had stripped itself of money to fight my mother's illness, and there was no more forthcoming. Her illness gradually became an accepted thing in the house, something that could not be stopped or helped. My mother's suffering grew into a symbol in my mind, gathering to itself all the poverty, the ignorance, the helplessness, the painful, baffling, hunger-ridden days and hours, the restless moving, the futile seeking, the uncertainty, the fear, the dread, the meaningless pain, and the endless suffering. Her life set the emotional tone of my life, colored the men and women I was to meet in the future, conditioned my relation to events that had not yet happened, determined my attitude to situations and circumstances I had yet to face. A somberness of spirit that I was never to lose settled over me during the slow years of my mother's unrelieved suffering, a somberness that was to make me stand apart and look upon excessive joy with suspicion, that was to make me self-conscious, that was to make me keep forever on the move, as though to escape a nameless fate seeking to overtake me. At the age of 12, before I had had 1 full year of formal schooling, I had a conception of life that no experience would ever erase. a predilection for what was real that no argument could ever gainsay, a sense of the world that was mine and mine alone, a notion as to what life meant that no education could ever alter, a conviction that the meaning of living came only when one was struggling to wring a meaning out of meaningless suffering. The spirit I had caught gave me insight into the sufferings of others, made me gravitate toward those whose feelings were like my own, made me sit for hours while others told me of their lives, made me strangely tender and cruel, violent and peaceful. It directed my loyalties to the side of men in rebellion. It made me love talk that sought answers to questions that could help nobody, that could only keep alive in me that enthralling sense of wonder and awe in the face of the drama of human feeling which is hidden by the external drama of life. I went to school feeling that my life depended not so much upon my learning as upon getting into another world of people. Until I entered Jim Hill Public School, I had had but 1 year of unbroken study. Each time I had begun a school term, something happened to disrupt it. Though I was not aware of it, the next 4 years were to be the only opportunity for formal study in my life. I studied night and day, and within 2 weeks I was promoted to the 6th grade. Overjoyed, I ran home and babbled the news. The family had not thought it possible. I told the family emphatically that I was going to study medicine, engage in research, make discoveries. Flushed with success, I had not given a second's thought to how I would pay my way through a medical school. But since I had leaped a grade in 2 weeks, anything seemed possible, simple, easy. I was now with boys and girls who were studying, fighting, talking. It revitalized my being. I knew that my life was revolving about a world that I had to encounter and fight when I grew up. Suddenly the future loomed tangibly for me, as tangible as a future can loom for a black boy in Mississippi. Most of my schoolmates worked mornings, evenings, and Saturdays. They earned enough to buy their clothes and books, and they had money in their pockets at school. To see a boy go into a grocery store at noon recess and let his eyes roam over filled shelves and pick out what he wanted, even a dime's worth, was a hairbreadth short of a miracle to me. But when I broached the idea of my working to Granny, she would have none of it. She laid down the injunction that I could not work on Saturdays while I slept under her roof. I argued that Saturdays were the only days on which I could earn any worthwhile sum, and Granny looked me straight in the eyes and quoted Scripture. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work. Thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thine ox, nor thine ass, nor any of thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates, that thy manservant and thy maidservant may rest as well as thou. And that was the final word. Though we lived just on the borders of actual starvation, I could not bribe Granny with a promise of half or 2/3 of my salary. Her answer was no, and never. Her refusal wrought me up to a high pitch of nervousness, and I cursed myself for being made to live a different and crazy life. I told Granny that she was not responsible for my soul, and she replied that I was a minor, that my soul's fate rested in her hands, that I had no word to say in the matter. School opened, and I began the 7th grade. My clothing became so shabby that I was ashamed to go to school. Many of the boys in my class were wearing their first long pants suits. I grew so bitter that I decided to have it out with Granny. I would tell her that if she did not let me work on Saturdays, I would leave home. But when I opened the subject, she would not listen. I followed her about the house, demanding the right to work on Saturday. Her answer was no, and no, and no. "Then I'll leave," I said, trembling violently. "You won't leave. You think I'm joking, don't you?" I asked, determined to make her know how I felt. "I'll leave this minute." I ran to my room, got a battered suitcase, and began packing my ragged clothes. I did not have a penny, but I was going to leave. She came to the door. "You little fool, put that suitcase down." "I'm going where I can work." She snatched the suitcase out of my hands. She was trembling. "All right," she said. "If you want to go to hell, then go. But God'll know that it was not my fault. He'll forgive me, but he won't forgive you." Weeping, she rushed from the room. Her humanity had triumphed over her fear. I emptied the suitcase, feeling spent. I hated these emotional outbursts, these tempests of passion, for they always left me tense and weak. Now I was truly dead to Granny and Aunt Addie, but my mother smiled when I told her I had defied them. She rose and hobbled to me on her paralytic legs and kissed me. The next day at school, I inquired among the students about jobs and was given the name of a white family who wanted a boy to do chores. That afternoon, as soon as school had let out, I went to the address. A tall, dour white woman talked to me. Yes, she needed a boy, an honest boy. $2 a week, mornings, evenings, and all-day Saturdays, washing dishes, chopping wood, scrubbing floors, cleaning the yard. I would get my breakfast and dinner. As I asked timid questions, my eyes darted about. What kind of food would I get? Was the place as shabby as the kitchen indicated? "Do you want this job?" the woman asked. "Yes, ma'am," I said, afraid to trust my own judgment. "Now, boy, I want to ask you one question, and I want you to tell me the truth," she said. "Yes, ma'am," I said, all attention. "Do you steal?" she asked me seriously. I burst into a laugh, then checked myself. "What's so damn funny about that?" she asked. "Lady, if I was a thief, I'd never tell anybody." "What do you mean?" she blazed with a red face. I had made a mistake during my first 5 minutes in the white world. I hung my head. "No, ma'am," I mumbled. "I don't steal." She stared at me, trying to make up her mind. "Now look, we don't want a sassy nigger around here," she said. "No, ma'am," I assured her. "I'm not sassy." Promising to report the next morning at 6 o'clock, I walked home and pondered on what could possibly have been in the woman's mind to have made her ask me point blank if I stole. Then I recalled hearing that white people looked upon Negroes as a variety of children, and it was only in the light of that her question made any sense. If I had been planning to murder her, I certainly would not have told her, and rationally she no doubt realized it. Yet habit had overcome her rationality and had made her ask me, "Boy, do you steal?" Only an idiot would have answered, "Yes, ma'am, I steal." What would happen now that I would be among white people for hours at a stretch? Would they hit me? Curse me? If they did, I would leave at once. In all my wishing for a job, I had not thought of how I would be treated, and now it loomed important, decisive, sweeping down beneath every other consideration. I would be polite, humble, say yes, sir, and no, sir, yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. But I would draw a line over which they must not step. Oh, maybe I'm just thinking up trouble, I told myself. They might like me. The next morning I chopped wood for the cook stove, lugged in scuttles of coal for the grates, washed the front porch and swept the back porch, swept the kitchen, helped wait on the table, and washed the dishes. I was sweating. I swept the front walk and ran to the store to shop. When I returned, the woman said, "Your breakfast is in the kitchen." "Thank you, ma'am." I saw a plate of thick black molasses and a hunk of white bread on the table. Would I get no more than this? They had had eggs, bacon, coffee. I picked up the bread and tried to break it. It was stale and hard. Well, I would drink the molasses. I lifted the plate and brought it to my lips and saw floating on the surface of the black liquid green and white bits of mold. God damn. I can't eat this, I told myself. The food was not even clean. The woman came into the kitchen as I was putting on my coat. "You didn't eat," she said. "No, ma'am," I said. "I'm not hungry." "You'll eat at home?" she asked hopefully. "Well, I just wasn't hungry this morning, ma'am," I lied. "You don't like molasses and bread," she said dramatically. "Oh, yes, ma'am, I do," I defended myself quickly, not wanting her to think that I dared criticize what she had given me. "I don't know what's happening to you niggers nowadays," she sighed, wagging her head. She looked closely at the molasses. "It's a sin to throw out molasses like that. I'll put it up for you this evening." "Yes, ma'am," I said heartily. Neatly, she covered the plate of molasses with another plate, then felt the bread and dumped it into the garbage. She turned to me, her face lit with an idea. "What grade are you in school?" "Seventh, ma'am." "Then why are you going to school?" she asked in surprise. "Well, I want to be a writer," I mumbled, unsure of myself. I had not planned to tell her that, but she had made me feel so utterly wrong and of no account that I needed to bolster myself. "A what?" she demanded. "A writer," I mumbled. "For what?" "To write stories," I mumbled defensively. "You'll never be a writer," she said. "Who on earth put such ideas into your nigger head?" "Nobody," I said. "I didn't think anybody ever would," she declared indignantly. As I walked around her house to the street, I knew that I would not go back. The woman had assaulted my ego. She had assumed that she knew my place in life, what I felt, what I ought to be, and I resented it with all my heart. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps I would never be a writer, but I did not want her to say so. Had I kept the job, I would have learned quickly just how white people acted toward Negroes. But I was too naive to think that there were many white people like that. I told myself that there were good white people, people with money and sensitive feelings. As a whole, I felt that they were bad, but I would be lucky enough to find the exceptions. As summer neared, my mother suffered yet another stroke of paralysis, and again I had to watch her suffer, listen to her groans, powerless to help. I used to lie awake nights and think back to the early days in Arkansas, tracing my mother's life, reliving events, wondering why she had apparently been singled out for so much suffering, meaningless suffering. And I would feel more awe than I had ever felt in church. My mind could find no answer, and I would feel rebellious against all life, but I never felt humble. Another change took place at home. We needed money badly, and Granny and Aunt Addie decided that we could no longer share the entire house, and Uncle Tom and his family were invited to live upstairs at a nominal rental. The dining room and the living room were converted into bedrooms, and for the first time we were squeezed for living space. We began to get on each other's nerves. Uncle Tom had taught school in country towns for 30 years, and as soon as he was under the roof, he proceeded to tell me what was wrong with my life. I ignored him, and he resented it. One morning, I was roused by my uncle's voice calling me gently but persistently. I opened my eyes and saw the dim blob of his face peering from behind the jamb of the kitchen door. "What time have you?" I thought he asked me, but I was not sure. "Huh?" I mumbled sleepily. "What time have you got?" he repeated. I lifted myself on my elbow and looked at my dollar watch, which lay on the chair at the bedside. 18 past 5, I mumbled. 18 past 5, he asked. "Yes, sir." "Now, is that the right time?" he asked again. I was tired, sleepy. I did not want to look at the watch again, but I was satisfied that on the whole I had given him the correct time. "It's right," I said, snuggling back down into my pillow. "If it's a little slow or fast, it's not far wrong." There was a short silence. I thought he had gone. "What on earth do you mean, boy?" he asked in loud anger. I sat up, blinking, staring into the shadows of the room, trying to see the expression on his face. "What do I mean?" I asked, bewildered. "I mean what I said. Had I given him the wrong time?" I looked again at my watch. "It's 20 past now." "Why, you impudent black rascal," he thundered. I pushed back the covers of the bed, sensing trouble. "What are you angry about?" I asked. "I never heard a sassier black imp than you in all my life," he spluttered. I swung my feet to the floor so that I could watch him. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "You asked me the time, and I told you." "If it's a little fast or slow, it's not far wrong," he said, imitating me in an angry, sarcastic voice. "I've taught school for 30 years, and by God, I've never had a boy say anything like that to me." "But what's wrong with what I said?" I asked, amazed. "Shut up," he shouted, "or I'll take my fist and ram it down your sassy throat. One more word out of you and I'll get a limb and teach you a lesson." "What's the matter with you, Uncle Tom?" I asked. "What's wrong with what I said?" I could hear his breath whistling in his throat. I knew that he was furious. "This day I'm going to give you the whipping some man ought to have given you long ago," he vowed. I got to my feet and grabbed my clothes. The whole thing seemed unreal. I had been confronted so suddenly with struggle that I could not pull all the strings of the situation together at once. I did not feel that I had given him cause to say I was sassy. I had spoken to him just as I spoke to everybody. Others did not resent my words, so why should he? I heard him go out of the kitchen door, and I knew that he had gone into the backyard. I pulled on my clothes and ran to the window. I saw him tearing a long, young green switch from the elm tree. My body tightened. I was damned if he was going to beat me with it. Until a few days ago he had never lived near me, had never had any say in my rearing or lack of rearing. I was working, eating my meals out, buying my own clothes, giving what few pennies I could to Granny to help out in the house. And now a strange uncle, who felt that I was impolite, was going to teach me to act as I had seen the backward black boys act on the plantations, was going to teach me to grin, hang my head, and mumble apologetically when I was spoken to. My senses reeled in protest. He would not beat me. I ran across the room and pulled out the dresser drawer and got my pack of razor blades. I opened it and took a thin blade of blue steel in each hand. I stood ready for him. The door opened. I was hoping desperately that this was not true, that this dream would end. "Richard," he called me in a cold, even tone. "Yes, sir," I answered, striving to keep my tension out of my voice. "Come here." I walked into the kitchen, my eyes upon him, my hands holding the razors behind my back. "Now, Uncle Tom, what do you want with me?" I asked him. "You need a lesson on how to live with people," he said. "If I do need one, you're not going to give it to me," I said. "You'll swallow those words before I'm through with you," he vowed. "Now listen, Uncle Tom," I said. "You're not going to whip me. You're a stranger to me. You don't support me. I don't live with you. You shut that foul mouth of yours and get into the backyard," he snapped. He had not seen the razors in my hand. I ducked out the kitchen door and jumped lightly off the porch to the ground. He ran down the steps and advanced with the lifted switch. "I've got a razor in each hand," I warned in a low, charged voice. "If you touch me, I'll cut you. Maybe I'll get cut too, but I'll cut you, so help me God." He paused, staring at my lifted hands in the dawning light of morning. I held a sharp blue edge of steel tightly between thumb and forefinger of each fist. "My God," he gasped. "I didn't mean to hurt your feelings this morning," I told him. "You insist I did. Now I'll be damned if I'm going to be beaten because of your hurt feelings." "You're the worst criminal I ever saw," he exclaimed softly. "If you want to fight, I'll fight. That's the way it'll be between us," I told him. "You'll never amount to anything," he said, shaking his head and blinking his eyes in astonishment. "I'm not worried about that," I said. "All I want you to do is keep away from me, now and always." "You'll end on the gallows," he predicted. "If I do, you'll have nothing to do with it," I said. He stared at me in silence. Evidently he did not believe me, for he took a step forward to test me. "Put those razors down," he commanded. I'll cut you, I said, hysteria leaping into my voice, my hands slicing out with points of steel as I backed away. He stopped. He had never in his life faced a person more grimly determined. Now and then he blinked his eyes and shook his head. "You fool!" he bellowed suddenly. "I'll make you bloody if you hit me," I warned him. His chest heaved and his body seemed to droop. "Somebody will yet break your spirit," he said. "It won't be you. You'll get yours someday. You won't be the one to give it to me. And you've just been baptized," he said heavily. "The hell with that," I said. We stood in the early morning light, and a touch of sun broke on the horizon. Roosters were crowing. A bird chirped nearby somewhere. Perhaps the neighbors were listening. Finally, Uncle Tom's face began to twitch. Tears rolled down his cheeks. His lips trembled. "Boy, I'm sorry for you," he said at last. "You better be sorry for yourself," I said. "You think you're a man," he said, dropping his arm and letting the switch drag in the dust of the yard. His lips moved as he groped for words. "But you'll learn, and you'll learn the hard way. I wish I could be an example to you." I knew that I had conquered him, had rid myself of him mentally and emotionally, but I wanted to be sure. "You're not an example to me. You could never be," I spat at him. "You're a warning. Your life isn't so hot that you can tell me what to do." He repaired chairs for a living now, since he had retired from teaching. "Do you think I want to grow up and weave the bottoms of chairs for people to sit in?" He twitched violently, trying to control himself. "You'll be sorry you said that," he mumbled. He turned his tall, lean, bent body and walked slowly up the steps. I sat on the porch a long time, waiting for my emotions to ebb. Then I crept cautiously into the house, got my hat, coat, books, and went to work. Went to face the whims of the white folks. I grew silent and reserved as the nature of the world in which I lived became plain and undeniable. The bleakness of the future affected my will to study. Was I really as bad as my uncles and aunts and Granny repeatedly said? Why was it considered wrong to ask questions? Was I right when I resisted punishment? It was inconceivable to me that one should surrender to what seemed wrong, and most of the people I had met seemed wrong. Ought one to surrender to authority, even if one believed that that authority was wrong? If the answer was yes, then I knew that I would always be wrong because I could never do it. Then how could one live in a world in which one's mind and perceptions meant nothing and authority and tradition meant everything? There were no answers. I dreamed of going north and writing books, novels. The North symbolized to me all that I had not felt and seen. It had no relation whatever to what actually existed. Yet, by imagining a place where everything was possible, I kept hope alive in me. But where had I got this notion of doing something in the future, of going away from home and accomplishing something that would be recognized by others? I had, of course, read my Horatio Alger stories, my pulp stories, and I knew my get-rich-quick Wallingford series from cover to cover, though I had sense enough not to hope to get rich. Even to my naive imagination, that possibility was too remote. I knew that I lived in a country in which the aspirations of black people were limited, marked off. Yet I felt that I had to go somewhere and to do something, to redeem my being alive. I was building up in me a dream which the entire educational system of the South had been rigged to stifle. I was feeling the very thing that the state of Mississippi had spent millions of dollars to make sure that I would never feel. I was beginning to dream the dreams that the state had said were wrong, that the schools had said were taboo. My classmates felt that I was doing something that was vaguely wrong, but they did not know how to express it. As the outside world grew more meaningful, I became more concerned, tense, and my classmates and my teachers would say, "Why do you ask so many questions?" or "Keep quiet." I was in my 15th year. In terms of schooling, I was far behind the average youth of the nation, but I did not know that. In me was shaping a yearning for a kind of consciousness, a mode of being that the way of life about me had said could not be, must not be, and upon which the penalty of death had been placed. Somewhere in the dead of the southern night, my life had switched onto the wrong track, and without my knowing it, the locomotive of my heart was rushing down a dangerously steep slope, heading for a collision, heedless of the warning red lights that blinked all about me, the sirens and the bells and the screams that filled the air. Luckily, the studies in the 9th, my last year at school, were light, and during a part of the term the teacher turned over the class to my supervision, an honor that helped me emotionally and made me hope faintly. It was even hinted that if I kept my grades high, it would be possible for me to teach in the city school system. The cold days dragged mechanically. Up early and to my job, splitting wood, carrying coal, sweeping floors, then off to school and boredom. The school term ended. I was selected as valedictorian of my class and assigned to write a paper to be delivered at one of the public auditoriums. One morning, the principal summoned me to his office. "Well, Richard Wright, here's your speech," he said with smooth bluntness, and shoved a stack of stapled sheets across his desk. "What speech?" I asked as I picked up the papers. "The speech you're to say the night of graduation," he said. "But, Professor, I've written my speech already," I said. He laughed confidently, indulgently. "Listen, boy, you're going to speak to both white and colored people that night. What can you alone think of saying to them? You have no experience." I burned. "I know that I'm not educated, Professor," I said, "but the people are coming to hear the students, and I won't make a speech that you've written." He leaned back in his chair and looked at me in surprise. "You know, we've never had a boy in this school like you before," he said. "You've had your way around here. Just how you managed to do it, I don't know. But listen, take this speech and say it. I know what's best for you. You can't afford to just say anything before those white people that night." He paused and added meaningfully, "The superintendent of schools will be there. You're in a position to make a good impression on him. I've been a principal for more years than you are old, boy. I've seen many a boy and girl graduate from this school, and none of them was too proud to recite a speech that I wrote for them." I had to make up my mind quickly. I was faced with a matter of principle. I wanted to graduate, but I did not want to make a public speech that was not my own. "Professor, I'm going to say my own speech that night," I said. He grew angry. "You're just a young, hot-headed fool," he said. He toyed with a pencil and looked up at me. "Suppose you don't graduate." "But I passed my examinations," I said. "Look, mister," he shot at me, "I'm the man who says who passes at this school." I was so astonished that my body jerked. I had gone to this school for 2 years, and I had never suspected what kind of man the principal was. It simply had never occurred to me to wonder about him. "Then I don't graduate," I said flatly. I turned to leave. "Say you, come here," he called. I turned and faced him. He was smiling at me in a remote, superior sort of way. "You know, I'm glad I talked to you," he said. "I was seriously thinking of placing you in the school system, teaching. But now, I don't think that you'll fit." He was tempting me, baiting me. This was the technique that snared black young minds into supporting the Southern way of life. "Look, Professor, I may never get a chance to go to school again," I said, "but I like to do things right." "What do you mean?" "I've no money. I'm going to work. Now, this 9th grade diploma isn't going to help me much in life. I'm not bitter about it. It's not your fault. But I'm just not going to do things this way." "You're just a young, hot fool," he said. "Wake up, boy. Learn the world you're living in. You're smart, and I know what you're after. I've kept closer track of you than you think. I know your relatives. Now, if you play safe," he smiled and winked, "I'll help you go to school, to college." "I want to learn, Professor," I told him. "But there are some things I don't want to know." "Goodbye," he said. I went home, hurt but determined. That night, Griggs, a boy who had gone through many classes with me, came to the house. "Look, Dick, you're throwing away your future in Jackson," he said. "Go to the principal, talk to him, take his speech and say it. I'm saying the one he wrote, so why can't you? What the hell? What can you lose?" "No," I said. "Why?" "I know only a hell of a little, but my speech is going to reflect that," I said. "Then you're going to be blacklisted for teaching jobs," he said. "Who the hell said I was going to teach?" I asked. "God, but you've got a will," he said. "It's not will. I just don't want to do things that way," I said. He left. 2 days later, Uncle Tom came to me. I knew that the principal had called him in. "I hear that the principal wants you to say a speech which you've rejected," he said. "Yes, sir, that's right," I said. "May I read the speech you've written?" he asked. "Certainly," I said, giving him my manuscript. "And may I see the one that the principal wrote?" I gave him the principal's speech, too. He went to his room and read them. I sat quiet, waiting. He returned. "The principal's speech is the better speech," he said. "I don't doubt it," I replied. "But why did they ask me to write a speech if I can't deliver it?" "Would you let me work on your speech?" he asked. "No, sir. Now look, Richard, this is your future." "Uncle Tom, I don't care to discuss this with you," I said. He stared at me, then left. The principal's speech was simpler and clearer than mine, but it did not say anything. Mine was cloudy, but it said what I wanted to say. What could I do? I had half a mind not to show up at the graduation exercises. I was hating my environment more each day. As soon as school was over, I would get a job, save money, and leave. Griggs, who had accepted a speech written by the principal, came to my house each day, and we went off into the woods to practice orating. Day in and day out we spoke to the trees, to the creeks, frightening the birds, making the cows in the pastures stare at us in fear. I memorized my speech so thoroughly that I could have recited it in my sleep. The news of my clash with the principal had spread through the class, and the students became openly critical of me. "Richard, you're a fool. You're throwing away every chance you've got." "If they had known the kind of fool boy you are, they would never have made you valedictorian," they said. I gritted my teeth and kept my mouth shut, but my rage was mounting by the hour. My classmates, motivated by a desire to save me, pestered me until I all but reached the breaking point. In the end, the principal had to caution them to let me alone, for fear I would throw up the sponge and walk out. I had one more problem to settle before I could make my speech. I was the only boy in my class wearing short pants, and I was grimly determined to leave school in long pants. Was I not going to work? Would I not be on my own? When my desire for long pants became known at home, yet another storm shook the house. "You're trying to go too fast," my mother said. "You're nothing but a child," Uncle Tom pronounced. "He's beside himself," Granny said. I served notice that I was making my own decisions from then on. I borrowed money from Mrs. Bibbs, my employer, made a down payment on a pearl gray suit. If I could not pay for it, I would take the damn thing back after graduation. On the night of graduation, I was nervous and tense. I rose and faced the audience, and my speech rolled out. When my voice stopped, there was some applause. I did not care if they liked it or not. I was through. Immediately, even before I left the platform, I tried to shunt all memory of the event from me. A few of my classmates managed to shake my hands as I pushed toward the door, seeking the street. Somebody invited me to a party, and I did not accept. I did not want to see any of them again. I walked home, saying to myself, "The hell with it." With almost 17 years of baffled living behind me, I faced the world. My life now depended upon my finding work, and I was so anxious that I accepted the first offer, a job as a porter in a clothing store selling cheap goods to Negroes on credit. The shop was always crowded with black men and women pawing over cheap suits and dresses, and they paid whatever price the white man asked. The boss, his son, and the clerk treated the Negroes with open contempt, pushing, kicking, or slapping them. No matter how often I witnessed it, I could not get used to it. How can they accept that? I asked myself. I kept on edge, trying to stifle my feelings and never quite succeeding, a prey to guilt and fear because I felt that the boss suspected that I resented what I saw. One morning, while I was polishing brass out front, the boss and his son drove up in their car. A frightened black woman sat between them. They got out and half dragged and half kicked the woman into the store. White people passed and looked on without expression. A white policeman watched from the corner, twirling his nightstick, but he made no move. I watched out of the corner of my eyes, but I never slackened the strokes of my chamois upon the brass. After a moment or two, I heard shrill screams coming from the rear room of the store. Later, the woman stumbled out, bleeding, crying, holding her stomach, her clothing torn. When she reached the sidewalk, the policeman met her, grabbed her, accused her of being drunk, called a patrol wagon, and carted her away. When I went to the rear of the store, the boss and his son were washing their hands at the sink. They looked at me and laughed uneasily. The floor was bloody, strewn with wisps of hair and clothing. My face must have reflected my shock, for the boss slapped me reassuringly on the back. "Boy, that's what we do to niggers when they don't pay their bills," he said. His son looked at me and grinned. "Here, have a cigarette," he said. Not knowing what to do, I took it. He lit his and held the match for me. This was a gesture of kindness, indicating that, even if they had beaten the black woman, they would not beat me if I knew enough to keep my mouth shut. "Yes, sir," I said. After they had gone, I sat on the edge of a packing box and stared at the bloody floor until the cigarette went out. The store owned a bicycle which I used in delivering purchases. One day, while returning from the suburbs, my bicycle tire was punctured. I walked along the hot, dusty road, sweating and leading the bicycle by the handlebars. A car slowed at my side. "What's the matter there, boy?" a white man called. I told him that my bicycle was broken and that I was walking back to town. "That's too bad," he said. "Hop on the running board." Then he stopped the car. I clutched hard at my bicycle with one hand and clung to the side of the car with the other. "All set?" "Yes, sir." The car started. It was full of young white men. They were drinking. I watched the flask pass from mouth to mouth. "Want a drink, boy?" one asked. The memory of my 6-year-old drinking came back and filled me with caution. But I laughed, the wind whipping my face. "Oh, no," I said. The words were barely out of my mouth before I felt something hard and cold smash me between the eyes. It was an empty whiskey bottle. I saw stars and fell backwards from the speeding car into the dust of the road. My feet became entangled in the steel spokes of the bicycle. The car stopped, and the white men piled out and stood over me. "Nigga, ain't you learned no better sense than that yet?" asked the man who had hit me. "Ain't you learned to say sir to a white man yet?" Dazed, I pulled to my feet. My elbows and legs were bleeding. Fists doubled, the white men advanced, kicking the bicycle out of the way. "Ah, leave the bastard alone. He's got enough," said one. They stood looking at me. I rubbed my shins, trying to stop the flow of blood. No doubt they felt a sort of contemptuous pity, for one asked, "You want to ride to town now, nigger? You reckon you know enough to ride now?" "I want to walk," I said simply. Maybe I sounded funny. They laughed. Before they got back into their car, they comforted me with, "Nigger, you sure ought to be glad it was us you talked to that way, 'cause if you'd said that to some other white man, you might have been a dead nigger now." I was learning rapidly how to watch white people, to observe their every move, every fleeting expression, how to interpret what was said and what was left unsaid. I held a series of petty jobs for short periods, quitting some to work elsewhere, being driven off others because of my attitude, my speech, the look in my eyes. I was no nearer than ever to my goal of saving enough money to leave. At times I doubted if I could ever do it. One jobless morning I went to my old classmate Griggs, who worked for a Capitol Street jeweler. He was washing the windows of the store when I came upon him. "Do you know where I can find a job?" I asked. He looked at me with scorn. "Yes, I know where you can find a job," he said, laughing. "Where?" "But I wonder if you can hold it," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Where's the job?" Take your time, he said. You know, Dick, I know you. You've been trying to hold a job all summer, and you can't. Why? Because you're impatient. That's your big fault. I said nothing because he was repeating what I had already heard him say. He lit a cigarette and blew out smoke leisurely. Well, I said, egging him on to speak. I wish the hell I could talk to you, he said. I think I know what you want to tell me, I said. He clapped me on the shoulder. His face was full of fear, hate, concern for me. Do you want to get killed, he asked me. Hell no. Then for God's sake, learn how to live in the South. What do you mean, I demanded. Let white people tell me that. Why should you? See, he said triumphantly, pointing his finger at me. There it is, now. It's in your face. You won't let people tell you things. You rush too much. I'm trying to help you, and you won't let me. He paused and looked about. The streets were filled with white people. He spoke to me in a low, full tone. Dick, look, you're black. Black. Black, see? Can't you understand that? Sure I understand it, I said. You don't act a damn bit like it, he spat. He then reeled off an account of my actions on every job I had held that summer. How did you know that, I asked. White people make it their business to watch niggers, he explained, and they pass the word around. Now my boss is a Yankee, and he tells me things. You're marked already. Could I believe him? Was it true? How could I ever learn this strange world of white people? Then tell me how I must act, I asked humbly. I just want to make enough money to leave. Dick, I'm treating you like a brother, he said. You act around white people as if you didn't know that they were white, and they see it. Oh, Christ, I can't be a slave, I said hopelessly. But you've got to eat, he said. Yes, I got to eat. Then start acting like it, he hammered at me, pounding his fist in his palm. When you're in front of white people, think before you act. Think before you speak. Your way of doing things is all right among our people, but not for white people. They won't stand for it. I stared bleakly into the morning sun. I was nearing my 17th birthday, and I was wondering if I would ever be free of this plague. What Griggs was saying was true, but it was simply utterly impossible for me to calculate, to scheme, to act, to plot all the time. I would remember to dissemble for short periods, then I would forget and act straight and human again, not with the desire to harm anybody, but merely forgetting the artificial status of race and class. It was the same with whites as with blacks. It was my way with everybody. I sighed. I guess you're right, I said at last. I've got to watch myself, break myself. No, he said quickly, feeling guilty now. Someone, a white man, went into the store and we paused in our talk. You know, Dick, you may think I'm an Uncle Tom, but I'm not. I hate these white people, hate 'em with all my heart. But I can't show it. If I did, they'd kill me. There's an optical company upstairs, and the boss is a Yankee from Illinois. Now, he wants a boy to work all day in summer, mornings and evenings in winter. He wants to break a colored boy into the optical trade. You know algebra, and you're just cut out for the work. I'll tell Mr. Crane about you, and I'll get in touch with you. Do you suppose I could see him now? I asked. For God's sake, take your time, he thundered at me. Maybe that's what's wrong with Negroes, I said. They take too much time. I laughed, but he was disturbed. I thanked him and left. For a week I did not hear from him, and I gave up hope. Then one afternoon Griggs came to my house. It looks like you've got a job, he said. You're going to have a chance to learn a trade. But remember to keep your head. Remember, you're black. You start tomorrow. What will I get? $5 a week to start with. They'll raise you if they like you, he explained. My hopes soared. Things were not quite so bad after all. I would have a chance to learn a trade, and I need not give up school. I told him that I would take the job and that I would be humble. You'll be working for a Yankee, and you ought to get along, he said. The next morning I was outside the office of the optical company long before it opened. I was reminding myself that I must be polite, must think before I spoke, must think before I acted, must say yes, sir, no, sir, that I must so conduct myself that white people would not think that I thought I was as good as they. Suddenly a white man came up to me. What do you want? He asked me. I'm reporting for a job, sir, I said. Okay, come on. I followed him up a flight of steps, and he unlocked the door of the office. I was a little tense, but the young white man's manner put me at ease, and I sat and held my hat in my hand. A white girl came and began punching the typewriter. Soon another white man, thin and gray, entered and went into the rear room. Finally, a tall, red-faced white man arrived, shot me a quick glance, and sat at his desk. His brisk manner branded him a Yankee. You're the new boy, huh? Yes, sir. He questioned me closely about my schooling, about how much mathematics I had had. He seemed pleased when I told him that I had had 2 years of algebra. How would you like to learn this trade? He asked. I'd like it fine, sir. I'd like nothing better, I said. He told me that he wanted to train a Negro boy in the optical trade. He wanted to help him, guide him. I tried to answer in a way that would let him know that I would try to be worthy of what he was doing. He then led me into the rear room of the office, which turned out to be a tiny factory filled with many strange machines smeared with red dust. Reynolds, he said to a young white man, this is Richard. What you saying there, boy? Reynolds grinned and boomed at me. Mr. Crane took me to the older man. Pease, this is Richard, who'll work with us. Pease looked at me and nodded. Mr. Crane then held forth to the 2 white men about my duties. He told them to break me in gradually to the workings of the shop, to instruct me in the mechanics of grinding and polishing lenses. They nodded their assent. Now, boy, let's see how clean you can get this place, Mr. Crane said. Yes, sir. I swept, mopped, dusted, and soon had the office and the shop clean. In the afternoons, when I had caught up with my work, I ran errands. In an idle moment, I would stand and watch the 2 white men grinding lenses on the machine. They said nothing to me, and I said nothing to them. The first day passed, the second, the third. A week passed, and I received my $5. A month passed. But I was not learning anything, and nobody had volunteered to help me. One afternoon, I walked up to Reynolds and asked him to tell me about the work. What are you trying to do? Get smart, nigger? He asked me. No, sir, I said. I was baffled. Perhaps he just did not want to help me. I went to Pease, reminding him that the boss had said that I was to be given a chance to learn the trade. Nigger, you think you're white, don't you? No, sir. You're acting mighty like it, he said. I was only doing what the boss told me to do, I said. Pease shook his fist in my face. This is a white man's work around here, he said. From then on, they changed toward me. They said good morning no more. When I was just a bit slow in performing some duty, I was called a lazy black son of a bitch. I kept silent, striving to offer no excuse for worsening of relations. But one day, Reynolds called me to his machine. Nigger, you think you'll ever amount to anything? He asked in a slow, sadistic voice. I don't know, sir, I answered, turning my head away. What do you niggers think about? He asked. I don't know, sir, I said, my head still averted. If I was a nigger, I'd kill myself, he said. I said nothing. I was angry. You know why? He asked. I still said nothing. But I don't reckon niggers mind being niggers, he said suddenly, and laughed. I ignored him. Mr. Pease was watching me closely. Then I saw them exchange glances. My job was not leading to what Mr. Crane had said it would. I had been humble, and now I was reaping the wages of humility. Come here, boy, Pease said. I walked to his bench. "You didn't like what Reynolds just said, did you?" he asked. "Oh, it's all right," I said, smiling. "You didn't like it. I could see it on your face," he said. I stared at him and backed away. "Did you ever get into trouble?" he asked. "No, sir." "What would you do if you got into trouble?" "I don't know, sir." "Well, watch yourself and don't get into trouble," he warned. I wanted to report these clashes to Mr. Crane, but the thought of what Pease or Reynolds would do to me if they learned that I had snitched stopped me. I worked through the days and tried to hide my resentment under a nervous, cryptic smile. The climax came at noon one summer day. Pease called me to his workbench. To get to him, I had to go between two narrow benches and stand with my back against the wall. "Richard, I want to ask you something," Pease began pleasantly, not looking up from his work. "Yes, sir?" Reynolds came over and stood blocking the narrow passage between the benches. He folded his arms and stared at me solemnly. I looked from one to the other, sensing trouble. Pease looked up and spoke slowly, so there would be no possibility of my not understanding. "Richard, Reynolds here tells me that you called me Pease," he said. I stiffened. A void opened up in me. I knew that this was the showdown. He meant that I had failed to call him Mr. Pease. I looked at Reynolds. He was gripping a steel bar in his hand. I opened my mouth to speak, to protest, to assure Pease that I had never called him simply Pease, and that I had never had any intention of doing so, when Reynolds grabbed me by the collar, ramming my head against the wall. "Now be careful, nigger," snarled Reynolds, baring his teeth. "I heard you call him Pease, and if you say you didn't, you're calling me a liar, see?" He waved the steel bar threateningly. If I had said, "No, sir, Mr. Pease, I never called you Pease," I would by inference have been calling Reynolds a liar. And if I had said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Pease, I called you Pease," I would have been pleading guilty to the worst insult that a Negro can offer to a Southern white man. I stood trying to think of a neutral course that would resolve this quickly risen nightmare, but my tongue would not move. "Richard, I asked you a question," Pease said. Anger was creeping into his voice. "I don't remember calling you Pease, Mr. Pease," I said cautiously. "And if I did, I sure didn't mean you black—" "You called me Pease then," he spat, rising and slapping me till I bent sideways over a bench. Reynolds was on top of me, demanding, "Didn't you call him Pease? If you say you didn't, I'll rip your gut string loose with this bar, you black granny dodger. You can't call a white man a liar and get away with it." I wilted. I begged them not to hit me. I knew what they wanted. They wanted me to leave the job. "I'll leave," I promised. "I'll leave right now." They gave me a minute to get out of the factory, and warned me not to show up again or to tell the boss. Reynolds loosened his hand on my collar, and I ducked out of the room. I did not see Mr. Crane or the stenographer in the office. Pease and Reynolds had so timed it that Mr. Crane and the stenographer would be out when they turned on the terror. I went to the street and waited for the boss to return. I saw Griggs wiping glass shelves in the jewelry store, and I beckoned to him. He came out, and I told him what had happened. "Then what are you standing there like a fool for?" he demanded. "Won't you ever learn? Get home. They might come down." I walked down Capitol Street feeling that the sidewalk was unreal, that I was unreal, that the people were unreal, yet expecting somebody to demand to know what right I had to be on the streets. My wound went deep. I felt that I had been slapped out of the human race. When I reached home, I did not tell the family what had happened. I merely told them that I had quit, that I was not making enough money, that I was seeking another job. That night, Griggs came to my house. We went for a walk. "You got a goddamn tough break," he said. "Can you say it was my fault?" I asked. He shook his head. "Well, what about your damn philosophy of meekness?" I asked him bitterly. "These things just happen," he said, shrugging. "They owe me money," I said. "That's what I came about," he said. "Mr. Crane wants you to come in at 10 in the morning. 10 sharp now, mind you, because he'll be there, and those guys won't gang up on you again." The next morning, at 10, I crept up the stairs and peered into the office of the optical shop to make sure that Mr. Crane was in. He was at his desk. Pease and Reynolds were at their machines in the rear. "Come in, Richard," Mr. Crane said. I pulled off my hat and walked into the office. I stood before him. "Sit down," he said. I sat. He stared at me and shook his head. "Tell me what happened." An impulse to speak rose in me and died with the realization that I was facing a wall that I would never breach. I tried to speak several times and could make no sounds. I grew tense, and tears burnt my cheeks. "Now just keep control of yourself," Mr. Crane said. I clenched my fists and managed to talk. "I tried to do my best here," I said. "I believe you," he said. "But I want to know what happened. Which one bothered you?" "Both of them," I said. Reynolds came running to the door, and I rose. Mr. Crane jumped to his feet. "Get back in there," he told Reynolds. "That nigger's lying," Reynolds said. "I'll kill him if he lies on me." "Get back in there or get out," Mr. Crane said. Reynolds backed away, keeping his eyes on me. "Go ahead," Mr. Crane said. "Tell me what happened." Then again I could not speak. What could I accomplish by telling him? I was black. I lived in the South. I would never learn to operate those machines as long as those two white men in there stood by them. Anger and fear welled in me as I felt what I had missed. I leaned forward and clapped my hands to my face. Now, Mr. Crane said. "Keep control of yourself. No matter what happens, keep control." "Do you want to work here?" he asked me. I looked at the white faces of Pease and Reynolds. I imagined their waylaying me, killing me. "No, sir," I breathed. "Why?" "I'm scared," I said. "They would kill me." Mr. Crane turned and called Pease and Reynolds into the office. "Now tell me, which one bothered you? Don't be afraid. Nobody's going to hurt you," Mr. Crane said. I stared ahead of me and did not answer. He waved the men inside. The white stenographer looked at me with wide eyes, and I felt drenched in shame, naked to my soul. The whole of my being felt violated, and I knew that my own fear had helped to violate it. I was breathing hard and struggling to master my feelings. "Can I get my money, sir?" I asked at last. "Just sit and take hold of yourself," he said. I waited, and my roused senses grew slowly calm. "I'm awfully sorry about this," he said. "I had hoped for a lot from this job," I said. "I wanted to go to school, to college." "I know," he said. "But what are you going to do now?" My eyes traveled over the office, but I was not seeing. "I'm going away," I said. "What do you mean?" "I'm going to get out of the South," I breathed. "Maybe that's best," he said. "I'm from Illinois. Even for me, it's hard here. I can do just so much." He handed me my money, more than I had earned for the week. I thanked him and rose to leave. He rose. I went into the hallway and he followed me. He reached out his hand. "It's tough for you down here," he said. I barely touched his hand. I walked swiftly down the hall, fighting against crying again. I ran down the steps, then paused and looked back up. He was standing at the head of the stairs, shaking his head. I went into the sunshine and walked home like a blind man. I knew what was wrong with me, but I could not correct it. I had begun coping with the white world too late. I could not make subservience an automatic part of my behavior. I had to feel and think out each tiny item of racial experience in the light of the whole race problem, and to each item I brought the whole of my life. While standing before a white man, I had to figure out how to perform each act and how to say each word. I could not help it. I could not grin. In the past, I had always said too much. Now I found that it was difficult to say anything at all. I could not react as the world in which I lived expected me to. That world was too baffling, too uncertain. I heard that hall boys were needed at one of the hotels. I applied and was accepted to mop long, white-tiled hallways that stretched around the entire perimeter of the office floors of the building. I reported each night at 10, got a huge pail of water, a bushel of soap flakes, and with a gang of moppers I worked. All the boys were Negroes, and I was happy. At least I could talk, joke, sing, laugh, say what I pleased. I began to marvel at how smoothly the black boys acted out the roles that the white race had mapped out for them. Most of them were not conscious of living a special, separate, stunted way of life. Yet I knew that in some period of their growing up, a period they had no doubt forgotten, there had been developed in them a delicate, sensitive, controlling mechanism that shut off their minds and emotions from all that the white race had said was taboo. Although they lived in an America where, in theory, there existed equality of opportunity, they knew unerringly what to aspire to and what not to aspire to. Had a black boy announced that he aspired to be a writer, he would have been unhesitatingly called crazy by his pals. Or had a black boy spoken of yearning to get a seat on the New York Stock Exchange, his friends, in the boy's own interest, would have reported his odd ambition to the white boss. Out of my salary I had begun to save a few dollars, for my determination to leave had not lessened, but I found the saving exasperatingly slow. I pondered continuously ways of making money, and the only ways that I could think of involved transgressions of the law. I had now seen at close quarters the haughty white men who made the law. I had seen how they acted, how they regarded black people, how they regarded me, and I no longer felt bound by the laws which white and black were supposed to obey in common. I was outside those laws. The white people had told me so. Now, when I thought of ways to escape from my environment, I no longer felt the inner restraint that would have made stealing impossible, and this new freedom made me lonely and afraid. My feelings became divided. In spite of myself, I would dream of a locked cupboard in a nearby neighbor's house where a gun was kept. If I stole it, how much would it bring? When the yearning to leave would become strong in me, I could not keep out of my mind the image of a storehouse at a nearby Negro college that held huge cans of preserved fruits. The idea of stealing floated tentatively in me. My inability to adjust myself to the white world had already shattered a part of the structure of my personality and had broken down the inner barriers to crime. I went through another week. Late one night I resolved to make that week the last. The gun in the neighbor's house came to my mind, and the cans of fruit preserves in the storehouse of the college. If I stole them and sold them, I would have enough to tide me over in Memphis until I could get a job, work, save, and go north. I crept from bed and found the neighbor's house empty. I looked about. All was quiet. My heart beat so fast that it ached. I forced a window with a screwdriver and entered and took the gun. I slipped it into my shirt and returned home. When I took it out to look at it, it was wet with sweat. I pawned it under an assumed name. The following night I rounded up 2 boys whom I knew to be ready for adventure. We broke into the college storehouse and lugged out cans of fruit preserves and sold them to restaurants. Meanwhile, I bought clothes, shoes, a cardboard suitcase, all of which I hid at home. Saturday night came, and I sent word to the boss that I was sick. Uncle Tom was upstairs. Granny and Aunt Addie were at church. My brother was sleeping. My mother sat in her rocking chair, humming to herself. I packed my suitcase and went to her. "Mama, I'm going away," I whispered. "Oh, no," she protested. "I've got to go, Mama. I can't live this way." "You're not running away from something you've done." "I'll send for you, Mama. I'll be all right. Take care of yourself. And send for me quickly. I'm not happy here," she said. I'm sorry for all these long years, Mama, but I could not have helped it. I kissed her, and she cried. Be quiet, Mama. I'm all right. I went out the back way and walked 1/4 of a mile to the railroad tracks. It began to rain as I tramped down the cross ties toward town. I reached the station soaked to the skin. I bought my ticket and waited for my train, my eyes watching the crowd. An hour later, I was sitting in a Jim Crow coach speeding northward, making the first lap of my journey to a land where I could live with a little less fear. Slowly, the burden I had carried for many months lifted somewhat. My cheeks itched, and when I scratched them, I found tears. In that moment, I understood the pain that accompanied crime, and I hoped that I would never have to feel it again. I never did feel it again, for I never stole again. And what kept me from it was the knowledge that, for me, crime carried its own punishment. Well, it's my life, I told myself. I'll see now what I can make of it. I could not have accounted, if it had been demanded of me, for all the varied forces that were making me reject the culture that had molded and shaped me. I was leaving without a qualm, without a single backward glance. The face of the South I had known was hostile and forbidding, and yet out of all the conflicts and the curses, the blows and the anger, the tension and the terror, I had somehow gotten the idea that life could be different, could be lived in a fuller and richer manner. It had been my accidental reading of fiction and literary criticism that had evoked in me vague glimpses of life's possibilities. Of course, I had never seen or met the men who wrote the books I read, and the kind of world in which they lived was as alien to me as the moon. But what enabled me to overcome my chronic distrust was that these books, written by men like Dreiser, Masters, Mencken, Anderson, and Lewis, seemed defensively critical of the straitened American environment. These writers seemed to feel that America could be shaped nearer to the hearts of those who lived in it. The White South said that it knew niggers, and I was what the White South called a nigger. Well, the White South had never known me, never known what I thought, what I felt. The White South said that I had a place in life. Well, I had never felt my place, or rather, my deepest instincts had always made me reject the place to which the White South had assigned me. It had never occurred to me that I was in any way an inferior being, and no word that I had ever heard fall from the lips of Southern white men had ever made me really doubt the worth of my own humanity. True, I had lied. I had stolen. I had struggled to contain my seething anger. I had fought, and it was perhaps a mere accident that I had never killed. But in what other ways had the South allowed me to be natural, to be real, to be myself, except in rejection, rebellion, and aggression? I was not leaving the South to forget the South, but so that someday I might understand it, might come to know what its rigors had done to me, to its children. I fled so that the numbness of my defensive living might thaw out and let me feel the pain, years later and far away, of what living in the South had meant. Yet deep down, I knew that I could never really leave the South, for my feelings had already been formed by the South, for they had been slowly instilled into my personality and consciousness, black though I was, the culture of the South. So in leaving, I was taking a part of the South to transplant in alien soil, to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps to bloom. And if that miracle ever happened, then I would know that there was yet hope in that southern swamp of despair and violence, that light could emerge even out of the blackest of the southern night. I would know that the South, too, could overcome its fear, its hate, its cowardice, its heritage of guilt and blood, its burden of anxiety and compulsive cruelty. With ever-watchful eyes and bearing scars visible and invisible, I headed north, full of a hazy notion that life could be lived with dignity, that the personalities of others should not be violated, that men should be able to confront other men without fear or shame, and that if men were lucky in their living on earth, they might win some redeeming meaning for their having struggled and suffered here beneath the stars.